he speaks of it as like living in a tent, and that the tent is our temporary life lived here on earth in this temporary, mortal human body that keeps on breaking down. Paul says that the earthly tent, the human body, this mortal life, is something that can be destroyed and wiped out. But nevertheless, knowing that it's all going to end, you and I go on living. Why is it that we go on living? Why is it that we can find a purpose in this life knowing that it's going to end someday? Paul says that living in the tent, we groan and we are burdened. Can I get a big groan out of the crowd today? Okay. Isn't that therapeutic? That's why we groan, just because, it just releases some of that's going on inside. We groan. We're burdened. The traveling life is tough. We're always having to pack up and move out. Sometimes in our travels throughout life, relationships last a lifetime. Sometimes they get broken. Think of the people you started out with. Remember those close friends you had back in high school. They're not always the people you finish up with. Paul knew this well. Perhaps when writing of groaning and being burdened, he's thinking of the people he's writing to, the Corinthians, the Corinthian Christians. They'd given him so much trouble in so many respects. Remember back, for those of you who are here, week 1 of the series, where we talked about being bold, and Paul was accused of being arrogant, of being too big for his britches, if you will. They questioned his authority. They accused him of being arrogant. They said he was prideful. They said that he was not out for their welfare. He was pouring out his life. And so there was a fracture in the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians. And so he writes, in this life, in this tent, we groan, we're burdened with all this brokenness. So how does Paul make it through this life? How does he go forward day by day, packing up his tent and moving on to the next city to share the gospel? How does he deal with the abuse and rejection from the rich and the powerful he meets in various cities? And worse than that, how does he deal with abuse from within his own Christian community? Paul gives us a hint of what drives him in verse 2. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. Paul lives in this life, but all the while he's living in this life, he longs for the next life. It's not a longing unrelated to the present life. It's not like you're somewhere and you just daydream and you wish you were somewhere else because maybe it's better over there, but it's really not when you get there, and so you go somewhere else. It's not that kind of wishing to be somewhere else just to escape. Paul camps out in this present life, but all the while he's headed to a far better place. He's headed to a place he calls home. Paul's not some guy running his little camper up and down the Pacific Coast Highway, stopping at whatever beach he likes with no particular place to go. He's not someone with too much time in his hands. His groaning comes from the fact that he's headed somewhere. His yearning to press onward comes from a sense of purpose, of being headed to a particular destination and of not being there yet. And that's part of the reason why he's groaning and he feels burdened, but yet he presses on. In many respects, Paul loved the tent life. He loved the preaching life. He loved the Christian community and the bonds of friendship that he formed in the church. And to a certain extent, Paul could deal with the adversity, the rainstorms that hit him hard when camping in a tent. He's a pretty strong guy after all, the shipwrecks and the rejections and all that. But what he really longed for, what he really groaned for, was to be out of his tent and into his home. Here's how Paul describes his destination, where he's headed, the end of the journey that keeps him going, that gives him a sense of purpose that he needs to push through the tough times. He talks of getting out of his current accommodation. He longs to be out of the temporary tent of the human body, out of the whole fragile, broken human experience. He's headed towards a house, a fixed place, a place where he can be forever. Specifically, he's headed from a tent here on earth to a new house, a new home in heaven. And for Paul, this new house is a new body. It's a resurrection body, which, just as the old body is a huge part of our present life. And what happens to our body matters. And what happens to our body is a huge part of our human experience. In the same way, our new body, our new resurrection body, Paul knows, is going to be a huge part of our future life, our future experience. The new body is like moving from a tent into a mansion. From, what is it, the Donald Trump show? What was it called? The Apprentice? Where the winners are living inside the mansion and the losers have to stretch out garbage bags to protect them from the rain outside. It's that kind of difference. It's like living in this life may seem great at times, but for Paul, it's nothing. It's rubbish, he says in some places, compared to what we shall enjoy in the future life. It's like the difference between an old, broken down tent and a beautiful new mansion. The new body, Paul also says in this text, is like being clothed after being naked. Doesn't that feel good to put on clothes? Right? It feels good. What Paul's trying to say is that being without a body, just a spirit floating around, would be like being naked, since we're meant to have a body to go along with our spirit. And so if some Corinthians were teaching about a higher spiritual existence outside the body, and some of them were teaching that, or if they were teaching that after death there's no resurrection, there's no new body, they're wrong, Paul says, because God would not leave us naked. The God who made us spirit and body has designed for our life, both present and future, that we live that life as spiritual people in a body. And so that's why we have a body in this life, and that's why we have a body in the next life. So while Paul lives here on earth, he knows he's serving the eternal purpose of God. What's the purpose here? We're getting back around to that question. What is our purpose? To travel towards eternity and to lead people with him on that journey by introducing them to Jesus. What's Paul's purpose? He's living in a tent and he's on a journey. He's traveling towards eternity. He's traveling towards that future home, and he wants to bring along on the journey and to the home as many people as possible. That's what he's trying to do. That's what his whole ministry is about. That's his purpose. That's our purpose as well. Paul has just spent several verses talking about how we live in a tent, but we're headed towards a mansion. How we're moving towards a future that's clothed in a glorious new human body, a glorious new resurrected human life. Then Paul writes that God has made us for this purpose. What is Paul trying to say? What is the great purpose that God's made us for? I think what Paul's trying to say is that God's made us for eternity. To look at this life, not just for what it appears to be, but to look at this life for where it's taking us. To evaluate this life not just on appearances, not just on what maybe seems to be real, but to evaluate this life on where we're headed, on where it's taking us. Every human life is going somewhere. And don't we have a certain curiosity about where other people's lives are headed, especially celebrities' lives? Isn't everybody curious about that? Think of the whole celebrity industry and the paparazzi and all the magazines and websites. Interest in celebrities' lives, especially when they're headed in the wrong direction, especially when they're caught not looking so glorious. Every life is headed somewhere, and where that life is headed will define its purpose. The Bible spells it out clearly. Either you're headed